Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live, how can Hollywood fix its diversity issue? We speak with the authors of a groundbreaking new study about the entertainment industry's $10 billion problem. Plus, now hiring Chief TikTok Officer. All that next. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's March 31st, and here's a quick look at the top headlines trending right now on LinkedIn. Pfizer says vaccine safe for kids, home prices skyrocket, and Nerf posts brand new TikTok position. Let's take a deeper look into that story. Nerf announced it's hiring for a unique position, Chief TikTok Officer. The job at Hasbro's iconic brand will pay $10,000 a month. Duties include producing 10 to 12 TikToks per month. Joining us now to discuss is Callie Schweitzer. She's marketing editor for us here at LinkedIn. Callie, I gotta admit, I'm not spending a lot of time on TikTok these days. That may show my age a little bit, but I mean, Chief TikTok Officer, I've heard of a lot of executive titles coming up the ranks in the past years, but what is this one about?
This is really a sign of the times, Caroline. There is such an interesting moment right now where brands are struggling with this idea of coming out of the pandemic and ways in which they can get into the center of culture. And for a brand like Nerf, this was a great way to capture a ton of press and start a ton of conversation. As you mentioned, this is a 3-month gig. Something interesting is that Bud Light has actually done something similar in listing a job description for a chief meme officer, giving a whole new meaning to the acronym CMO. So these are something that's becoming a little bit of a trend and also very stunt driven.
This is a small question, but do these people report to the CEO? Why is chief in the title, and how do the other chief title officers feel that there's now a chief meme officer with them maybe around the executive table?
I think there's a lot of goodwill toward the humor of it and the idea that this is not somebody coming on full time at an executive level. This is somebody coming on to grab a lot of good press and create a lot of great social assets. So I think there's a sense of it's all kind of tongue in cheek, but it's certainly weird. And one of the things that Nerf calls out in its job description is that it's a great job title, right? This is something that people would love to put on their LinkedIn.
Absolutely. And I can see it becoming one of the emerging skills that we see coming out maybe next year in one of our reports. Callie, but let's break this down. Kids can't have TikTok accounts, right? So what is Nerf's strategy here? Guns on the site for kids, but are kids there?
So there's been a heated debate on LinkedIn about this and whether this is genius or completely inappropriate marketing. As you said, the full experience on TikTok is not available to those under 13. There is a separate section for younger users, but some of the critics are saying, hey, it's not right to be marketing a product on TikTok and bringing all these people to TikTok who are part of this younger age, right? TikTok has already had a lot of issues around child safety and protection, specifically around those under 13 creating accounts and then seeing things and participating in challenges that are very dangerous, to say the least. So this is something where there's been a lot of pushback and a lot of questions around this because people are saying, well, I'm an adult, I love Nerf, or I'm an adult and I'm going to buy a Nerf football for my child. It's not supposed to be targeted at those under 13, but there is some conversation around this idea of, is it going to bring the under 13 set to a platform that is not really regulated for them?
Yeah, challenging questions. Do you have a Nerf football with you there, Callie, that we could maybe virtually throw around? No?
Okay. I don't, but we totally should.
Maybe next time. All right. Well, what are the key learnings here? We typically have a lot of marketers joining us on LinkedIn News Live. Should other companies think about adopting this position in some capacity?
It's interesting because over time, as we've seen with Instagram, audience engagement editors, Facebook, all sorts of social positions have popped up over the last few years. The Washington Post, they have the TikTok guy. More and more people will be hired for roles that are specifically around populating and curating a TikTok account for a brand. But I think Chief TikTok Officer, Chief Meme Officer, those are specific things where those titles may be a bit elevated for something that is not really going to come to the masses.
Yeah, I'll be surprised if we have one of those here at LinkedIn anytime soon. Callie, as always, thanks for breaking down these fun headlines with us. We'll see you next time on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was Callie Schweitzer. She leads marketing for us here on LinkedIn News. And for more stories like these, be sure to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed. Or if you're in mobile, you can click into that search box. The entertainment industry is losing out on $10 billion in revenue by shutting down stories led by Black voices. That's the latest in a report out by McKinsey on Black representation in film and television and the impact of increasing diversity. Joining us now to discuss is Sheldon Lin. He's a partner at McKinsey, and Franklin Leonard, the founder and CEO of The Blacklist and a member of the BlackLight Collective, a coalition of Black leaders, artists, and executives who work in various capacities around the film and TV industry. Franklin, Sheldon, welcome to LinkedIn News Live.
Great to be with you.
All right, Sheldon, I'm going to start with you. McKinsey, you're the money guy. Entertainment execs, I think they want to make money. So what's going on here? Break down some of the biases that are fueling the numbers behind this report.
Absolutely, Carolyn, and thanks again for having me. So look, you said it in the setup that $10 billion, that's the amount of money that Hollywood is currently leaving on the table. And we would say, how do we get here, right? So it doesn't seem obvious that a well-developed industry, decades old, would be leaving this much value on the table. And it's because over time, a set of factors, a set of customs, practices, structures have conspired to really suppress the market for Black-led content in three fundamental ways. Number one, distribution, where Black-led projects get distributed in 30 and fewer markets, even though they perform per market. They get under-invested in, so even though they deliver more per dollar spent at the box office, they see a lot less in production spend, 40% less, a lot less in marketing spend, 40% less. And then on content creation, Black creatives only account for 4.3% of all the projects coming out of Hollywood. So the combined effect of that is $10 billion lost.
And Sheldon, you started the Blacklist to hopefully explode that 4.3% that we just heard. I'm sorry, Franklin, that we just heard from Sheldon. Franklin, just break down a little bit for me what the Blacklist is and what the goal is with that project.
Yeah, so the Blacklist actually started having nothing to do with race. It was an annual survey of Hollywood's most liked unproduced screenplays. And very quickly, the industry, in looking for great content, said, if we make these scripts, they go on to great success, both financially and critically. And in fact, about 1,200 scripts have been on the list in about the last 15 years. A third of them have been produced. They've made about $28 billion in worldwide box office. Harvard Business School actually came out with a study 2 years ago that found that all things equal, movies made from scripts on the Blacklist make about 90% more in revenue than movies made from scripts not on the Blacklist, which I think goes to the sort of core of what the McKinsey finding was, which is there's a lot of conventional wisdom about what makes money, about what can be viable to audiences that is all convention and no wisdom. That's true about the value of screenwriters, which the Blacklist has shown. And I think it's true about the value of Black content creators and Black content, as the McKinsey study makes a very, very strong case for.
And I want to break down some of the findings of that study. But before we do, I'm going to say hello to some members who are joining us in the stream right now. We have Kyle from Texas, Laura from Indiana, Robert from California, Vincenzo from Italy, and Fahad from Germany. Fun fact, Franklin's joining us from Ireland right now. Sheldon, where are you?
I'm in Southern California, San Diego.
All right, I'm in California as well. So we got a full house here. And if you are joining us in the stream right now and have questions about the entertainment industry, now is the time. We're breaking down the Hollywood industry's pervasive representation issue with two experts on the topic. So if you have questions, let us know in the stream. Franklin, I'll go back to you on a question that I have. I feel like a lot of members in the stream likely don't understand how projects get greenlit, how Black creators get their voices heard and get the money to be able to produce their projects on the big or small screens. Can you break that process down a little bit for us?
I can try. I mean, it's actually a very complicated process. And one of the things that I think the McKinsey study really does an effective job of communicating is just how heavily interdependent the value chain in Hollywood is, right? So if you write a screenplay, hopefully you can manage to get an agent or a manager. That manager or agent will send your script out to producers and potential financiers. Hopefully they will then option it or acquire it. You will then send that script to directors and actors in the hopes of packaging it up. And then at a certain point, when you have what's perceived to be a great script, a director who can sort of handle it, actors who can sort of carry the day when it comes to marketing the film, then you go to a potential financier and they make a financial judgment on how much money they believe the movie is likely to make. Obviously, their budget and their marketing would hopefully be less than what their hope for revenue would be on that film, and then you'll be greenlit with a budget and then expected budgeted for marketing. And as you can imagine, at all of those steps, right, getting representation, having your material sent out as widely as possible to as many different types of producers as possible, to as many different financiers as possible, getting a director attached, getting actors attached, having that economic valuation of how much money the movie can make both domestically and in various international territories, and how much marketing spend the studio will spend on it. At all of those steps, what we're seeing is that Black content, Black creators are undervalued as compared with what their merits would suggest that they would be afforded.
And I found the budget stat in the report one of the most startling. The budgets given to Black films are less despite higher earnings per dollar. Sheldon, what's going on here in terms of this discrepancy between what the films are earning and what they're being budgeted out by the industry?
There's a lot going on. We would say books are economically rational. So what would explain a circumstance where you have more return for Black-led projects and for a dollar spent? And there's a lot there. I might start at the top. I might start where decisions get made. And you might have seen in the report, we found that 92% of executives are white. And it's hard to separate that stat in terms of who is sitting in those critical seats that make these decisions of what gets greenlit, what kinds of budget signed to different projects, notion of who are the people, what is the make of that critical body of decision makers. So I would start there. And the other factors around, the idea that most of the representation comes from the handful of Black creatives who've made it, where if a project has at least one Black producer, there's a massive chance you'll have 73%. But if there's no Black producer, that number drops to less than 1%. And that is over a 5-year period, almost 800 films. So who sits in these critical roles that make these decisions of what projects get greenlit, what is the funding allocation, how do we configure the team that drives the project? So, we should start there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If I could jump in, actually, I think one of the most remarkable findings of the study is that the Hollywood film business is actually the least diverse sector of American business, right? It is less diverse at 92% white than energy, than healthcare, than financial services. And so I think that really what happens is that when you bring a project to decision makers and say, even if you say, look, here are the numbers, right? There was a study out of USC, Stacy Smith and the Annenberg Institute, that found that, again, holding all things equal, budgets, marketing, there is no signal within the numbers that, diverse content underperforms internationally vis-a-vis white content. But you present the numbers and say, look, there's all of this evidence. We're watching Black Panther on the screen right now, but if you go back over 30 years, Coming to America made hundreds of millions of dollars internationally. And rather than looking at the data and behaving in an economically rational way, there's an assumption that, those are one-offs. Those are exceptions that prove the rule that, again, ultimately, this conventional wisdom about what works in Hollywood is far more convention than it ever was wisdom.
And Franklin, that gets me to why, you used to work at McKinsey and then encouraged them to do this report. What are the specific dangers of not diversifying Hollywood, given just the phenomenal cultural impact that they have on the stories that we all tell ourselves of what life looks like?
Yeah, look, it is not a new idea that sort of politics and society live downstream from culture, right? It extends as far back as I've been able to track it to 1703 and a Scottish poet named Andrew Fletcher who said, "Let me write the songs of a nation and who will may write the laws," a quote that's often misattributed to Plato. Frederick Douglass often referenced that in speeches. And the reality is that if you look at the history of Hollywood, right, Hollywood's first blockbuster was Birth of a Nation, a film that sort of concretized in the American imagination the notion of Black male criminality. And though some things have changed, not much has. If you look at the last 20 years, for example, roughly 64% of gang members shown in American films were Black. If you look at the Department of Justice study about how many gang members in America are Black, it's roughly 32%. So the consequences of the stories that Hollywood tells and who tells those stories and broadcast them, 40 feet high around the world and into devices in all of our hands and on our walls really determines in many ways how we see ourselves, how we see each other, and how we value each other as fellow human beings when we go out into the world.
These issues are so important, and I'm seeing more members joining us to discuss. We have Stephen from New Jersey, Vicky from California, Myra from New York, and Daniel from Canada. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live. Sarah says, big fan of your work, Franklin. Very cool to be hearing from you live. And we have a question here from Daniel, maybe that Daniel from Canada, who asks, who are the equity investors that can make this change? Who are the stakeholders that really need to drive change and awareness on this issue?
Sheldon, I think you can probably speak to the corporate structure of this better than I can.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is widely reported now in the news that, Charles D. King, who was one of the top Hollywood agents, has now started a fund with some collaborators to invest $100 million in bringing diverse content to the screens. And I do think there's an angle here around what's going to drive change. And shareholders are a critical place to start. And we're starting to see almost, frankly, a parallel universe where to the extent these massive barriers have held back Black creatives, they're creating a parallel universe where they're seeking their own capital to start ventures that will then start to prove out, even beyond what we've seen from the data, prove out that these properties actually do make money and more so than others. So to your point, absolutely, there's a critical role to be played here by private investors, but also by publicly listed company shareholders to put pressure to go after not just this $10 billion in value out there, but also to unleash a next great era of creative art form. Because we've got to believe that for every Black Panther that we've seen, there's probably 2 or 3 more out there. For every Jordan Peele, there's probably 2 or 3 more out there. Just that the dynamics of the industry have prevented those artists, those projects from coming to life.
And Franklin, I'm seeing a question that seems to be a follow-up from what we were just discussing from Joshua. He's asking, how much of an effect do you see international box office numbers having on diversity within Hollywood projects? Is that shifting in terms of how Hollywood is perceiving those numbers?
Well, what I'd say is that unfortunately, the fact of international box office numbers are not having the effect that they should be on the production of Black content. If we were paying attention to the numbers and we were sort of running the analysis that McKinsey has, what we would see is that if you make Black films at the budgets that equivalent white films are made at, if you market them with the equivalent budgets that white films are marketed with, and you distribute them in the number of territories that the equivalent white films are distributed in, they would make more money. And the return on investment, that's not just domestic, that's domestic and international, on a per dollar box office basis is more than 10%, the equivalent white content. So I think it's really important that we try to remember Hollywood is not acting in an economically rational fashion. They're making decisions based on other factors that have nothing to do with the actual bottom line. The other thing I would add, we're talking about this $10 billion a year figure. That is only the figure that results from solving the anti-Black animus problem. If you add to that the failures of the industry with regard to representation of women, the Latinx community, the MENA community, the Asian community, the LGBTQ plus community, the disability community, there is a far greater bounty for the industry to claim and for all the companies within it to claim. One of the things that I'm sort of most struck by is that McKinsey has given the industry, not just Black Hollywood, the industry as a whole, a treasure map by which to claim literally tens of billions of dollars a year. And the real question is how much longer will corporate boards, shareholders, equity investors tolerate sort of almost laughably comical, suboptimal financial results?
Well, that begs the question for Sheldon here. What has been the response of the report? Do you have big time directors knocking down your door saying, we need to partner, I want to know more?
Absolutely. And we've started a process to really effect change. So obviously the report was quite well received and we're grateful for that. So we started a process with the BlackLight Collective, frankly, and others to really have some conversations with the key players in the industry. And going back to something Franklin said, one of the things that made this difficult and hard to square between the value creation and the choices being made is that Hollywood is not a company. It's not one company. It's an ecosystem. And it's going to be very crucial, we would say, for the industry to act as a whole. So everywhere from the talent agencies, the unions, the studios, the networks, financiers, distribution companies, the critics establishment, award shows, etc., to get together to go after this in some coordinated fashion. The real temptation, very competitive space, is for each company, each entity to try to go it alone. And our view, given the way the industry works, is that they will have to come together, likely forming some cross-company body to drive this change.
And going through the report, Franklin and Sheldon, I think what struck me the most is that McKinsey discovered close to 40 specific pain points that Black professionals in the film and TV industry regularly face. 40 pain points, and these are over a myriad of, as Franklin just discussed, different processes of how productions get greenlit, and it's so pervasive. How are these pain points different than, say, the struggles that Black professionals face in other industries? I know that McKinsey is not just studying Hollywood, but biases that exist in other industries against Black workers. What's distinct about Hollywood in terms of the struggles that Black workers face?
Yeah, and
I'm gonna kick this to you, Sheldon, because you had an example about being an engineer at NASA that I think really nails it.
Yeah, and the first thing we should all, broadly speaking, in America, come at this question with a lot of humility. There's a lot of work to be done in all places. That said, Hollywood is quite distinct on a few different fronts. And I'll give the example of, if you were an engineer, let's say an aerospace engineer, you could imagine a world where you would go to NASA, and if NASA were inclusive and created the right sponsorship and avenues for promotion, you would become a top rocket scientist in your field, just from working within NASA. If you went to Hollywood, by contrast, you would have to be, in any given week, as a professional, working with talent agencies, unions, guilds, networks, financiers, distribution companies, etc. So this whole idea that Hollywood is an ecosystem, that it requires cross-company navigation to be successful, is one critical point of differentiation. The second one is that Hollywood's workplace is quite informal. So most of these projects occur in remote locations, often on set, without a normal, you might say, HR infrastructure. And then the final point to be made, and this is a crucial point around the ease with which people get dislodged, is that most of the work for creatives occur on a short-term basis, temporary contracts. So unless you get well-established, well embedded, it's very difficult to be effective. So again, those 3 points paint a quite unique picture for what it will take to be effective in driving change around diversity, equity, and inclusion in Hollywood.
And Sheldon, the report points to several solutions towards the problem. I want to know which one strikes out to you to be the most effective. If you were to be able to wave a magic wand other than getting rid of systemic racism, what would you do to make things different for the stories that we see both on the big and small screen?
Yeah, I mean, so we combined and compressed to 4 that we listed in the report, but we actually had over 40 different potential actions, including the idea of a cross-company entity to drive change that avoids the black tax and having Black professionals do the work. But if I had to point to one, Caroline, it would be this question of representation in those critical leadership and multiplier roles. So what does the boardroom look like? What does the C-suite look like? Who makes up the department heads, unit heads? Who are the key people behind the camera? Writers, creators, directors, showrunners. If I were to have one domino fall, it would be, let's make sure those critical leadership roles look like the population. And to Franklin's point, that's not just about Black representation. And if we could somehow get those leadership roles, the cascading effect around recruiting, the campuses we go to, HBCUs, 2-year colleges, the idea of funding equitably, the idea of giving license to creatives to create projects that expand the full spectrum, explore the full spectrum of the imagination. I would start with that, leadership roles.
And Franklin, before I let you and Sheldon go, I saw you on CNBC talking about this report, and you said, for someone like you who's been in the industry for over 18 years, this isn't news, despite journalists like myself on programs like this portraying it as news. But I'm curious, after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, have the conversations that you've had with executives in the industry changed? Do you see progress moving forward?
I'll be honest, this study was really initiated in the wake of those murders. I remember in early June of last year, I believe it was June 2nd of 2020, it was Blackout Tuesday. And I remember being at home on lockdown like most of us were, and looking at my social media feeds and seeing a lot of black tiles and a lot of corporate publicity statements that silence is complicity and that we must do better. And that didn't really square with what I had seen in my 18 years, then 17 years in the industry. And so having worked in the industry as long as I have, having been in those rooms, I knew that it was critical, not just for people to say, this is important to us. It was important that people, allocate resources to act on their stated priorities. My father was in the Army for 25 years and is prone to aphorisms. And one of his favorites that drove me crazy as a kid, but I see its wisdom now as an adult, was, don't tell me your priorities, show me your budget. And I think that if it's true that the industry believes that silence is complicity, that we must do better, and it's true that there's $10 billion a year to claim industry-wide, at least, I would think that there would be budgets that would reflect those stated priorities. And, being a quant person, having worked at McKinsey, I'm waiting to see those budgets, and I'm waiting to see those resource allocations before I make any declaration that the mission is on progress.
Talk is one thing, but money is a completely other thing, as these two, current McKinsey employee and former can say as well. Sheldon, Franklin, thank you so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live. I see so many members joining us in the stream. Appreciative for the work that you're doing and for breaking down these stats for us.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks to you, to Sheldon and Franklin, for joining us to discuss diversity in Hollywood and how we can have more Black-led voices on the big and small screens. Tomorrow on LinkedIn News Live, we're having a conversation about the minimum wage debate and what it means to hike the federal base pay for American workers. We'll dig into the political and economic arguments for and against. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.